by Harry Styles on the cello.
How are you and your generation leading with action to address some of the issues that matter most to you?
So thank you for listening to my music. As a musician and also a medical student, I think there's so many different kinds of unique issues that my generation faces. Some of those are, an increasing cost of education in our country, increasing cost of healthcare. I also think that we have a significant portion of people in our country that are uninsured and do not have access to healthcare. The world is very dominated by technology, and being able to find personal human connection and finding that balance is very important. Even though my generation has to deal with the issue of increasing division and the polarization on the internet, I find that music has a unique ability to bring people together. I also believe that our generation is unique in that we can use our spontaneous access to information to find creative solutions to problems. So thank you for listening. And if you like my music, feel free to check me out on Instagram and also on TikTok at Andrew Savoya. Thank you.
Everyone, my name is Julia Manchester. I'm a national political reporter at The Hill, and it's so nice to be back here in person. I think the last time I was at Longview with a Hill event was in 2019 before the end time, so it's great to see everyone. And thank you so much to Andrew Savoya for a really nice introduction. That was really beautiful. We're happy to be joined by members of the administration, youth advocates, activists, and probably most importantly, members of Gen Z themselves. They can help us better understand their values, beliefs, and where their common ground lies in our hopes to co-create change. And I'd also, of course, like to thank our sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation, for their support of the evening's event. But first, a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to ask you all to keep your cell phones on silent. I promise you can look at them afterwards, but we do encourage you to join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hill Events, and we will be using the hashtag #TheHillGenZ. And with that, I'm very excited to welcome our first panel to the stage. The oldest members of Generation Z are entering the workforce. They're able to vote, and like some, Maxwell Frost, who is from my home district in Central Florida, they're even old enough to become elected members of Congress. It's important that we understand their values, identities, and desires to give us a better sense of who they are and who they expect and what they expect for the path ahead. Joining us now for a deeper dive into the question of who is Gen Z is John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics and author of Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America, and Ava McDonald, the 21-year-old Georgetown student and founder and CEO of Zfluence, a social media marketing company that partners with Gen Z consumers. Ava and John, welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to pose a question to both of you. First, to start off with, talk about who Gen Z is and what their core issues are. I mean, we saw very historically important election last Tuesday or last week, and defying the historical norms and such. And a lot of that, I think, can be attributed to Gen Z. So I want our audience to understand who this generation is. Ava, I'd like to go first to you because you are, of course, a member of Gen Z.
Yes, well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'm excited to offer a Gen Z perspective. I think when you define Gen Z, I think the most important thing to consider is that Gen Z, more than anything, is concerned with authenticity. And Gen Z wants to participate in the kinds of things that are directly affecting them, whether that's social media, whether that's politics. So being that Gen Z is the first generation to never know a world without the digital media, we are very sensitive to the kinds of things that we see, the ways that we're represented. So I think that as a demographic group, it's important to consider how Gen Z isn't okay with just being spoken to or told what they want, but they want to be listened to and heard and involved in the kinds of things that are directly impacting their lives.
Yeah, and John, you've studied this group quite a bit and how they've been involved politically and their political evolution. Talk about your findings in that field.
Sure. Again, thank you for having me and being. I'm always nervous speaking with an actual member of the generation. Make sure that you check me if I say something that doesn't sound right. But I've been studying young Americans now for 22 years, a long time. And I was really struck in 2017, essentially when the eldest members of this generation were coming of age, thinking about politics for the first time. And there's two or three things that I take away from this. I don't think that there's any generation in at least 70 years who has dealt with more trauma more quickly before their brain is actually fully developed than Generation Z, right? Born just on the, thank you. Born on just after such a kind of 9/11, the Great Recession, really being one of their first memories in the disquiet, kind of in the home, going to school thinking that should be a place where it should feel safe. It's anything but safe because of school shootings and lockdown drills, thinking about middle school and high school, the tremendous impact that opioid abuse had, climate change, the concern about the whiplash between no drama Obama versus Trump, just a lot of chaos in their lives. But rather than, and we've seen that obviously sadly through the increasing levels of depression and death by suicide. However, what gives me hope is that despite all of that, all those weights that so many members of Ava's generation carry, rather than pulling back, they actually lean forward and have been voting, not just in this cycle, but in the last two cycles at rates that no other generation previous has voted. When baby boomers were younger, when Gen X was younger, when millennials were younger, they voted at somewhere between 25 and 50% less often than this generation. And we have a very different outcome of this last election, if not for Gen Z. If you just look at the number of voters under the age of 30, only 11%. But they added 3 percentage points in the Democratic column on a national basis.
Yeah.
They essentially kind of canceled out the 28% of voters over the age of 65 who would vote Republican by 3 points. So really relatively small generation in terms of their impact in the midterm election, but had significant influence because of the overwhelming support they gave for Democrats by 28 points.
And do you think we would have seen more of an actual red wave instead of a red trickle or misting?
There was a red wave among votes over the age of 40.
Yeah, but
okay?
yeah.
Right, so folks over the age of 40 were 11 points, voted for Republicans by 11 points. Mm-hmm. Voters under 40, the combination of millennials and G, plus 18 for Democrats. Plus 18 for Democrats, minus 11, a 29-point difference. So there was a red wave among Gen Xers and Boomers and silent generation. It was like the force, the passion, the intensity, not just the turnout, but the 28-point margin for the youngest of this generation that is responsible for essentially kind of blocking that red wave and electing Fetterman and Kelly in particular. Each of those candidates got over 70% of the under 30 vote.
Right.
70%. It's huge.
Right. And Ava, Ava, just as a member of the generation and you're consuming this political content that maybe the Fetterman campaign is feeding Gen Z voters, I mean, I think a lot of us, I covered the campaign quite closely, and a lot of us were skeptical as to whether his digital presence would really break through. A lot of us thought it, was sort of had to deal with the fact that he wasn't physically on the campaign trail for quite some time. But do you think someone who has a digital-centric campaign like that is able to better communicate with members of the Gen Z population?
Absolutely, and I think that it's important for politicians to meet Gen Z where they are. Personally, I do not consume any news in a physical newspaper. Mm-hmm. All of the news that I am consuming is either online, via social media, or I guess through friends who are also seeing things online and sending them to me. So it's interesting to consider with this new demographic the way that the kind of transfer of information has changed. And in order to attract a different demographic, you really have to think about, where are they? Because we are not, picking up physical newspapers, we are not consuming information in the same way that generations past have. So I think that's definitely really important.
Right. And then in terms of, I guess, the issue, and I asked you this question at the beginning, but I want to delve deeper into it. Maxwell Frost, the first member of Gen Z to be elected to Congress, he focused quite a bit on gun control and combating gun violence throughout his campaign. He himself was a victim of gun violence. That's an issue, but also, the pandemic and such. I mean, I think I always look back to my alma mater, Ithaca College, and I wonder, oh my gosh, how did all of these students who were meant to graduate in person had to finish up virtually and such? The pandemic had such probably just a totally different impact on your generation. Do you think those are the two main drivers, pandemic response, but also gun control for Generation Z voters, or is there something more?
I think that those are, of course, factors, because those are two things that have really impacted us. So I graduated high school during COVID. Mm-hmm. I began college at Georgetown during COVID. So that was a very big period of time where I felt pretty isolated and really only had social media to connect with my friends.
Yeah.
And that's also another reason why I feel like it's so important that politicians consider where Gen Z is, because at that time, and even in the business that I'm in, which is Gen Z influencer marketing and authenticity, companies would ask me all the time, isn't this an awful time for social media marketing because we're in COVID? And I say all the time that Gen Z is on their phone now more than ever. Mm. And that is not something that has changed post-COVID. So, I mean, that is something that's remained true during COVID, and it's also in the way that we discuss political issues and are also talking about the things that are important to us, whether that's, gun control or violence or other things that are impacting us as a generation and will impact future generations as we get older.
And John, turning back to some of these candidates, so you had Maxwell Frost on the Democratic side. He won his election pretty handily. Caroline Leavitt was at one point, I think, projected or predicted to potentially win.
Well, that's a whole other
that
conversation.
a whole other conversation. I wanted to get a sense as to, maybe she's a member of Generation Z. He is too, but do you think her campaign could have done something different to appeal to or is it just the fact that Generation Z voters lean to the left?
They more than lean to the left. This is like each generation has a different identity. My generation, Gen X, has essentially kind of been split 50-50 now, certainly leaning more right than center recently, but there's opportunities, I think, for Democrats and Republicans to kind of engage with this generation if they choose to. Perhaps one of the more remarkable surveys I conducted this year for my company, Social Sphere, conducted a project for Snapchat. And among 18 to 20 different issues and values related to this election, we found that preserving individual rights and freedoms was number one. In a survey we conducted in January, 5 months before the Alito leak, 6 months before the Dobbs decision. That was already kind of in the air. And the reason is because I think there's so many young people are concerned around culture war and concerned that those more vulnerable than them are under attack. In the Harvard survey we released a few weeks before the election, 73% of Americans feel that other Americans are under attack. 59% feel like they're under attack. So the combinations of those three things, two things, that's the reality that Gen Zers, I think, are carrying. And that is a significant driver of motivation to go out there and to kind of participate in civic life, specifically in voting. And, the Dobbs decision really kind of cemented that as a driver. And just like in 2018, when we saw increasing levels of participation in voting post the March for Our Lives movement, we saw the same thing happening in Kansas, and there were plenty of warning signs that this would be as significant a turnout as we saw in 2020 and 2018. So yeah, I think Caroline Leavitt, though she reflects a portion, I don't think she speaks for a plurality, or certainly not a majority of her generation, because younger people, remember, before that, like Bernie Sanders. So it's not about age, it's about the values. Values, number one. Number two is the way I say it is messenger, and number three is message.
And speaking of those values and messaging, it seems like at the end, well, maybe throughout the campaign, but it was certainly amplified at the end, this idea of protecting democracy, pushing back against these election-denying pro-MAGA candidates really seemed to work well for Democrats, obviously. Ava, as a member of the generation watching that, do you think that was a strong message that, you guys had to sit through and watch January 6th like the rest of us? You're old enough to obviously comprehend it and such. Was that a powerful message?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a moment for Gen Zers. I know that the majority of Gen Zers do identify as left-leaning, but there are some who are right-leaning. But in that moment of January 6th, I feel like us as an entire generation came together, and it was a big moment that we realized what was going on with the country. And I think after that, a lot of people who might not have participated were motivated to become more involved, to learn more, to read more about it, to maybe take a politics class or a government class in their high school or college. So I think that was definitely a big point where members of Gen Z realized that participation is really important, because this is the world that we're going to inhabit. This is the country we're going to inhabit, and it's going to have the most impact on us, not our parents or our grandparents.
And John, we've talked about these issues, protecting democracy, abortion access, and look, I'll say it, I was skeptical over whether those would be issues that would really break through. I think for a lot of us pundits and those in the media, admittedly, we thought this was going to come down to the inflation and the economy and crime, the situation at the southern border, and maybe in some cases it did, but clearly there were these other issues. I guess where did we get that wrong? Where did some of the polling or the forecasting get that wrong? Was that because we didn't look too closely at Gen Z?
I think that's a big part of it. CBS News released a poll, the last poll before the election, which indicated that They didn't find it to be likely, but that if the Democrats were going to have a chance to hold the House, it was going to be because of what Gen Z was going to deliver. We've been doing this for 22 years. We've conducted 100,000 surveys, okay, over that time, hundreds of focus groups. Our research indicated, and we do a couple thousand just 18 to 29-year-olds every single wave. Our research indicated that just as many said they intended to vote as in 2018. The average political survey, if there's 1,000 people or even a couple thousand people, which is a lot, still only has a few hundred, right? And I think it's certainly kind of conventional wisdom that young people, don't show up for elections, right? But listen, if you were a betting person, you'd win more than you would have lost over the last 40 years. When baby boomers were young voters, when Gen X were young voters, and millennials were young voters, the highest level they've ever participated in a midterm election was 21%. So any baby boomer or Gen Xer or anybody older than 30 who complains about young people voting, the chance is you probably didn't vote or voted at a lower level. When 2018 came, Gen Z doubled the level of participation from the previous election. Wow. And they voted for the first time at record numbers in 2020. And they were responsible for those 5 battleground states going from red to blue. They did the same thing. So the data is there if you open your eyes and actually look for it, number one. The other, two other issues, I think, in terms of the way we think about polling. One is so many people are focused on one issue, right? Inflation. Well, the other 4 issues after that, oftentimes, were democracy or abortion or climate or things that certainly went in towards a Democrat's favor. Right? So I think it was a mistake to say it's just single issue voters on the economy. And the other thing is about its enthusiasm, right? Younger people might not have been as enthusiastic to vote, but as I say, I'm not enthusiastic to go to the dentist next week, but I'm still gonna go, right? It's not the best measure anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So the last thing I'd just say on this is I looked at NBC polling a year ago. It was a 2-point Republican advantage. Every single month they tracked. October, their last poll was a 1-point Republican advantage. So there really wasn't as much change when you pull back as we might think when we look at some of these aggregators.
Ava, do you feel that as a Gen Z voter, oftentimes you're overlooked, or do you think campaigns are making a concerted effort to appeal to members of your generation?
I think that campaigns are making more of an effort as time goes on and as Gen Z becomes eligible to vote. I was able to vote for the first time in 2020. But I do think that campaigns are starting to realize that Gen Z has a lot of power and that we will go to the polls and that we'll vote and that this actually means something to us. And politics are something that we're talking about because, I mean, it's what we see on social media. We have the opportunity to engage digitally with the news. We have information that is so readily accessible to us. So I think it's good because I think campaigns are finally realizing that Gen Z is a powerful demographic that will show up and is talking about politics.
And with your work with Zfluence, you are trying to promote marketing for members of the generation and such. What would you tell companies, what would you tell campaigns that are trying to appeal to your demographic?
I think the biggest thing to tell companies or campaigns that are trying to appeal to Gen Z is to listen. So I'm running my company. I'm a member of Gen Z. Our entire network of more than 5,000 Gen Zers, reaching 55 million Gen Zers nationwide, are all Gen Z. And we all have opinions, and we all have thoughts. And the thing that's so cool is that Zfluence started as an influencer marketing platform, but now brands are working with their Zfluencers as advisory board members. And they're asking them, like, is this good? Do you like how this aligns with this value? Is this something that's important to you? So I think it's cool also that brands and campaigns have aligned themselves with social values that are important to show that they're actually doing the work and that they want to appeal to Gen Z in a way that's not just capitalizing on something they read online that Gen Z cares about, but they're really listening to them. And that kind of goes back to the point that Gen Z wants to participate, and when they feel listened to, they will.
Yeah. And John, I mean, I'm a millennial. You said you're a member of Gen X. What do you think we get wrong about Generation Z voters?
I think it's what Ava said, like the lack of listening, to truly listen and to kind of shape, again, not just focus on what, as a pollster, not what the message is, but where do our values align with Gen Z's values, right? And I think that's really what we don't spend enough time doing, truly listening through qualitative and other kinds of informal research.
Right, right. Well, speaking of listening, I think we have time for a few audience questions. So we have folks with microphones. If anyone has a question, just a few minutes.
I have a question for Ava. So one thing that I learned recently, I'm a millennial, so one thing I learned recently, and I work with a lot of Gen Z activists, and I learned that for Gen Z, the experience of the insurrection was particularly visceral because of a connection between what students face in schools with the gun violence epidemic. And the message that apparently was going around in social media was like, now they know how we feel. Is that something that you picked up on, or is that something you can comment upon?
That is really interesting, and I had never thought about that connection explicitly before, but I mean, it makes sense. And also, I think just we've experienced so many school shootings. It's like there's one happening all the time, and we're seeing it on social media, and it's become something that's unfortunately so expected and a part of just the world that we're in right now. So that makes complete and total sense, but it is a shame, and it calls out the point that it's become something that's so expected that there's violence at a place that there really shouldn't be. But that is a really interesting theory.
As we look for the next question, just one point. A year ago, 7% in our Harvard youth survey indicated that we had a healthy democracy. Today, it's 4%. 4% of 18 to 29-year-olds are inheriting what they would consider to be a healthy democracy. Yet, we wonder why, was democracy on the ballot? And I give them so much credit for participating in what they feel is such an unhealthy democracy. That's the difference between this generation and others. They don't like it, they think it needs reform, but they're willing to do the work to reform it.
That's very important. So we have less than a minute left, so I'll just wrap up this panel. Ava and John, thank you so much. It's great to get all of your insight on such a very important topic and learn something new today. Thank you. So next up, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, race and politics reporter for The Hill, Cheyenne Daniels, for our next panel.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. The explosion of social media, a global pandemic, and social unrest across the country has created a generation of civic activists on issues like racial justice, climate change, and much more. Yet, Gen Z's lived experience of democracy has been largely polarized and divided. Joining us now to discuss what it will take to restore trust and strengthen youth engagement in democracy are Reed Howard, Senior Director of Communications at Millennial Action Project.
Thank you.
Winter Brianne, Impact Strategist, Activist, and student at Howard University. And Rob Flaherty, Director of the White House Office of Digital Strategy. Thank you all so much for being here. Winter, I'd like to start with you. We're going to start with the basics, though. Gen Z has some very distinct political interests and desires. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those desires are from your own perspective and from what you've heard from others that you've connected with?
Yeah, for sure. Is this on? It's like so, I don't know. Anyways, so I think like the...
You're good.
Okay, cool. I would say a couple things. I think one thing that Gen Z from other generations
I have Michael here. She's one of
is
our
the fact that we're a generation of we and not I. I don't know if it's me.
And then she still has, Cheyenne is still working on that.
Cheyenne is still on.
I think we've got some background noise coming in from our green room.
She's going to be cool.
I don't know if they can hear us. I can hear you, but I want to make sure these folks and our folks online can hear you. All right, I think we're good.
Cool.
But no, like Gen Z is really a generation of we, right? And I think what that means is because we're born in this digital age where we're connected to people who otherwise previous generations would have never been connected to based on where they live, locality, and that sort of thing. Gen Z, when we like show up in our everyday lives, and particularly when we go to the voting block, what we're thinking about is not just ourselves. We're thinking about the greater community. And I think like you see across generations that, especially in America, we have a very individualist culture where, you know, everyone wants the best for them and their families, but oftentimes it's at the expense of others. And so I think when Gen Z shows up to the voting block, they're not just thinking about themselves, you know, they're thinking about that person in Florida that may be like dealing with flooding because of climate change, you know, but they may live in Arizona. Or they're thinking of like the young Black woman who was dealt with police violence, you know, and that person who's thinking about the person may have never dealt with that before. And so I think because of the digital age and our interconnectedness, we care about a lot of social issues, practically every social issue. And I think the thing that makes us different is that we collectively care. And it's not just the people who face those issues themselves.
But it's interesting that you talk about how this translates at the voting booth, because a lot of Gen Z hasn't been able to cast their first ballot just yet. But that's not stopping you from touring elementary schools and talking about civic participation and getting those young voters engaged. Do you find that there is a disconnect for young voters to understand just how important civic engagement is, or do they innately know that because of some of these things you're discussing?
I think there's two things. When it comes, yes, so me, my first election I was ever voted in was in 2018. Before that, I could never vote. Actually, no, not 2018, 2020. I was 17 in 2018. But before that, I had been actively like at the polls with my families, with my friends. I was that person who really helped them understand their ballot. But the thing that people don't often talk about is like how inaccessible. And so, yeah, like with a lot of my work before I was even of age to vote was really about galvanizing young people, starting at the age of like 6, 7, 8, about what it means to like hold the power of their voice, but then also translate that into civic action.
Rob, I want to go to you as well to talk about what the digital team has learned over these past few years when it comes to connecting with these young voters, getting them engaged, getting them educated on some of the things that are going to be impacting them as they go to cast that ballot.
Sure, of course. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, great. Okay, great. I have the karaoke mic, so I would love the Britney Spears mic, though. No, I think the White House has always had a space for communicating with people. Literally, the White House, the West Wing is constructed around the idea that we use the media to talk to people. There's a room for it, right? People shout questions at a press secretary and whatever. But the idea of communicating directly to people via reporters, I mean, we know that's kind of a dated model now, both for two reasons. One, because the White House now can communicate directly with people through our social media channels, through the president's voice, and all of these things. But the other thing is that, you know, the aperture for who people get information from, in particular young people, is a lot wider now. You know, reporters and media are a great way to talk to people who care about the news, right? Cat Fancy Magazine is a great way to talk to people who like cats. But, you know, we have to talk to a lot of people who live beyond, like, the daily news cycle. And a lot of young people are following it really closely, and a lot aren't. And so that means, a YouTuber is going to have just as much salience to folks as Jake Tapper, right? And so it means that we need to actually dedicate resources to going out and talking to folks in the places where they are. And so we are the first White House to actually have dedicated staff for social media content creators who we're engaging with on a regular basis, both through briefings, which we did around the war in Ukraine, which ended up being an SNL cold open, which we wear as a badge of honor, but through individual engagements with the president. He was in Detroit with Daniel Mack, who's a prominent TikToker. On the day we signed, or the day we were celebrating the Inflation Reduction Act, we had about 20 prominent TikTokers. I think Khalil is going to do this at some point. He was one of them. I think the reality is it just means young people get information from a lot of different places, and so we need to be there. And so that's the imperative.
But some of those places are not traditional places, as you mentioned. We have TikTok, which I know my mom, who I hope is watching out there somewhere, does not know what TikTok is, would be very confused why I would be getting news off of TikTok. Yeah. How do you communicate with somebody from an older generation who would say, why aren't you communicating with us in a different way? Or how is this actually helping our young people stay informed?
Well, there's two things. One, accepting the premise. 1/3 of young people in a Pew study recently said they go to TikTok in breaking news moments for search, right? People are using TikTok just the same way they are Google, the same way they're using YouTube. And so when news is breaking, people are going there, and we need to communicate with folks in the places where they are in those moments. But the other thing is, this is not just a Gen Z behavior. And in fact, Gen Z's behavior is sort of a leading indicator for the way that older generations are behaving. For a really long time, the hottest growth sector on Facebook was 65 plus. And so just because it's Gen Z who are leading the way and using the tools doesn't mean they're the only ones there. And so certainly when we do an engagement with Olivia Rodrigo, that's reaching a certain amount of people. When we do something with the Shade Room, that's reaching a different audience. And when we do Instagram Live with the AARP, that's reaching a different audience too. And so we have to we have to lead with our audiences first, and then kind of work out who they're sort of engaging with from there.
Rita, I want to bounce this off of you a little bit. So once those engagement activities reach the people that they're supposed to reach, they get them to the polls as they're supposed to be, and then we see young leaders elected like Maxwell Frost, I know was brought up in the previous panel. You yourself were elected to DC when you were just 19 years old. You now work with millennial and Gen Z elected officials through your MAP program. Talk a little bit about how you see young leaders govern differently than older, for lack of a better word, leaders.
Yeah, so when young people show up in halls of power, they really do govern differently than some of their older counterparts. So what my organization does is connect, engage, and mobilize a new generation of leadership. We're not just focused on election day, but what happens in the 700 plus days in between those governing days. And the way that we see all of the pandemics, the wars, the economic crises have impacted Gen Z and millennials is showing up in a way that they're much more pragmatic about who they work with to get stuff done. And that might surprise a lot of people, but in state houses across the country, out of all of the legislators, only 21% are under the age of 45, but 32% of the bipartisan bills that were not only authored but passed were written by members of Gen Z and millennials. And so they're scoring really high on these indexes of bipartisanship because they want to get things done to make their communities better. And they're part of the most diverse generation in history. Gen Z, is full of people across spectrums of ideology, of race, of religion, and they're wanting to work with people who are unlike them to get things done for their generation. Yeah.
That's powerful, too, to see that bipartisanship as you talk about it. I know there was a MAP report that said 334 millennial and Gen Z candidates ran this election cycle. Is there a reason that we're seeing this sudden surge in young folks wanting to not just be part of the political system in terms of voting, but to be part of making that legislation, to having those bipartisan conversations?
Yeah, I think so. I think young people are seeing that there's a ton of problems, and instead of running away from them, they have to run towards them. And they're committed to doing what needs to be done and to solve the issues that are impacting their local communities. And if that means through elected office, they're going to pursue that route. And so there's 27 members of Gen Z who are in state houses across the country. There's more that are joining them after this most recent election. There's one member of Gen Z that's coming to Congress, like you said, and we're really excited to see the ways that they work across the aisle, build these creative coalitions in order to get things done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Winter, I want to ask you very quickly, maybe not so quickly, it's a heavy question. Are we ready for this? Identity is such an important part for so many people when it comes to casting our ballot. And we're both two young Black women up on this stage. We have many Black folks in our audience tonight and hopefully listening at home as well. You told 17 magazine that a major part of your activism is to work toward liberation for all people, particularly Black people. You said once Black people are free, everyone is free. So I want to turn that question that you asked in 17 back to yourself, which is, how do you see Gen Z further the movement for Black liberation and for Black folks to be able to take that liberation forward to these political institutions?
Yeah, I would also like to say, which may be contrary to the beliefs of this room, like I don't believe that electoral politics is what's going to get us to liberation. I think it's a tool in the toolbox, but I do not think that it's a die-alone solution, and I don't think the solution solely lies in politics at all. But you've also seen, like historically, the political landscape has often pushed against liberation of Black people because it makes money, and and so because of that, I think when I'm talking to Black people, I'm talking to people across the country and Gen Z in general, we understand that like voting and being engaged civically is a power move. We can't play like only against the system, we have to play within the system as well. And I think it's definitely a huge tool in the toolbox, like the idea of voting and making our voices heard in that manner, just as big as it is to be in protest. And so with that being said, like previously, I think young people across the board care about more people other than just themselves. And so I think we see like record numbers of like when you go to Black Lives Matter march, it's not just Black people, you know what I mean? Whereas like previously, oftentimes Black people were some of the only people showing up and fighting for their liberation. And so that's really amazing to see, and it's really exciting to see. And so that also does translate, like I feel like at the voting box as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, how is the digital team working to ensure that diverse and younger communities feel represented in the content that you are seeking and putting out?
It's a great question. Oh, am I on? There I am. No, that's a great question. It's like the most important question. The way that sort of the internet is moving towards is like everybody's version of the internet is hyper-personalized now. People expect content that is like given to them, that feels natural to them. The BS-ometer for young people is much higher. The reality is, in an environment where content is so personalized, you need to have content creators who are diverse to be able to produce content that feels resonant to people. It's not just like a moral, like it's important to do, but you cannot function as a person producing content, as a team producing content, if the audiences you need to talk to do not feel reflected in the stuff that you're producing, and you get that by hiring people who have different experiences in their content and different lived experiences too. And so it is one of the biggest priorities of the Biden administration, certainly to hire a diverse team, but it is mission critical for the president's political digital team back in the campaign. It was mission critical for the team that we built at the White House, and I think there's sort of no question that it's the most important thing you can do as a person who leads a content creation shop.
Reed, I want to ask you as well, very interesting to me is because the work that you do, where you're able to talk with so many leaders who are our age, maybe a little bit older than me and Winter right here, what are you hearing from these leaders on what they want the future to look like, and what are they doing to reach that future, to make those goals come to fruition?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really clear is young people are not interested in the culture war. They want to bring down some of this rhetoric because they see how much communities are being radicalized and hurt by some of the rhetoric coming out of our political class. They also want to change what it means and what it looks like to be a politician. They're often, focusing their resources on constituent services and community organizing when they're in office. And they're trying to find unique and novel ways to connect with the community so that they can constantly hear their voice and uplift them and bring them along in the legislative process. And so when you're changing that narrative about who's allowed to be in politics, about who are in the halls of power, you can build a healthier democracy where people see themselves reflected in their elected officials and the intentions of their elected officials. And hopefully that means that we're going to have more equitable halls of power so that we're passing legislation that changes people's lives.
I want to go ahead and turn it over to the audience, see if we have any audience questions for our panelists up here.
Here. My question's for Mr. Flaherty, but it's kind of relevant to your last point that you were making just there. When it comes to the culture war issues which turn off, Generation Z, a number of those things are the kind of things which, swing voters and moderates in swing districts do care about. And so a lot of the things which, you'd be presenting to Gen Z, aiming at a specific audience, none of that occurs in a silo. So what's the cost-benefit analysis from like a White House digital strategy point to weigh up, okay, well, this is really going to work for Gen Z, but people on the outskirts of Pittsburgh will hate it. Like, how do you kind of make that work out those trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, from a pure political perspective, if you look at what just happened a couple of weeks ago, right? We were successful as a party because we talked about the rights that people were going to lose, the things that people were going to lose under under MAGA Republicans too. So, I don't think it's about culture wars or not culture wars. It's about a conversation about, the kind of extremism and divisiveness that Republicans were making part of their agenda. So, I think we ran on a pretty, or we sort of articulated a pretty unified message. And that had salience with young people, certainly. It had salience with independents. And so I think the things are, you can try to over-target your message, but at the end of the day, it's important to have sort of one consistent overarching narrative. Certainly, there were things like student loans and marijuana policy that we talked about down the stretch that had increased salience with young people. But those were things that were popular across the board, whether it was with young people or older folks. So I don't think there's a distinction to the way we think about issues when it comes to younger people versus older or swing districts or anything like that. I think we found a message that was resonant generally across the board, and I think that's why Democrats were so successful last week.
I think we have time for one more audience question.
Do you think Generation Z and youth voters in particular will lose interest, especially if White House candidates fail to deliver on promises like student loans that are currently being backtracked, or abortion rights that is also currently being backtracked?
Was that directed toward any specific one of our panelists? Any of our panelists want to take that one?
Well, one of the things that I would say, so I work for a nonpartisan organization, but we have a caucus in the Congress that's chaired by a Republican and a Democrat called the Congressional Future Caucus. And this is one of the most productive and bipartisan Congresses in recent history. They've passed overwhelming bills, from the Inflation Reduction Act to the CHIPS Act that it made major investments in infrastructure, technology, education. And so we're seeing that there are a lot of results that are coming out of this Congress, and it's the responsibility of some, perhaps, legislators to message that more effectively to Gen Z, to let them know all the great things that are getting done. But there's real results that are coming out in a bipartisan way from not just the Democrats, but Republicans who are willing to work with them. And when you see how productive these legislators are actually being, the ways that they are really getting creative about the coalitions they build to deliver these results. That's a message that will inspire more young people to get to the polls. The fact of the matter is we were only able to get these wins that we did have because young people showed up. And so when you show up more, when you deliver more legislators who are willing to work across the aisle, like I mentioned, MAP did a study with the Lugar Center at Georgetown University that measured how bipartisan members of Congress under the age of 45 are, and they scored to be 56% higher than the historical average. So they're working across the aisle, they're getting results, and that should be reason for young people to continue to show up at the polls, to return other young members of Congress and members of state houses who are gonna get those results.
And then, like, also to your point, like, going to piggyback off what you're saying, I think there is a discussion about the responsibility of the political establishment to actually meet young people where they're at and care about the issues, not just when it's election cycle. Because every election cycle, you know, especially since 2018, there is, like, you know, these messages that, you know, maybe we really care about, like, your, like, education, like you mentioned, like with the student loans, or we really care about racial justice, but then by the time elected officials are in office, we don't see as much action on those. And so I think a part of it is it's a two-lane street. Like, if you want people to show up for you consistently, you need to show up for them consistently. And I think particularly with the Black community, with like young people, we've kind of had allegiances to parties even when they didn't in turn provide that same allegiance. And so I think it's gonna be interesting actually to see how the next election cycle turns around, because we are expecting things to change, you know? And I do think we're gonna continue to show up to the polls because our lives are the ones that are at stake, really. But I do think it's also important to like shift that conversation around like, not just how do we get young people to show up, but how do you actually show up for young people?
All right, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much to my panelists this evening.
I think it's really important to have younger generations and also representatives from groups that have been historically disenfranchised at the table when making these policy decisions.
Because when everyone gets together to safely speak about how they want something to change, there is a greater chance of it actually happening. I think everyone kind of has their own role, which contributes to that certain like cause that you're trying to achieve.
No matter what, you need to go out and vote no matter what. Like, you have to make your voice heard. And going out and voting is the way of making your voice heard. Maybe not as meaningful as I would like it to be.
Civic engagement is definitely one of the most important ways to bring about change. I think that real change comes from the people in a country, and the leaders and people in power will answer to the people.
It brings individuals and communities together to work on something and protects public values, and it just makes a change in the community.
And we all need to come together and work to help better our community and our country. And for that, I think there needs to be a fair representation from all different types of people, different races, genders, religions, beliefs, and even work status.
It's good to listen to the other side of the issue and see their differences and similarities before agreeing on one specific side. Nothing is ever going to come out perfect if you decide to do the extreme.
I think the people that need to be at the table making meaningful progress are the people who are affected by the decisions being made.
I think that it's always possible at the end of the day to find common ground with those that you disagree with, if everyone is being really honest and open about the source of their source for their perspectives and experiences that have shaped who they are and what they believe.
I define collaboration between two people as being an exchange of ideas, a period of time where people are brainstorming together and allowing the diversity of their skills and opinions to blend together in an effective means.
Good evening, and thank you, The Hill, and thank you, Lamar. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm a senior communications officer with the Walton Family Foundation. And the foundation, we work in 3 areas: strengthening the connection between K-12 education and lifelong opportunity, and protecting rivers, oceans, and the communities they support, and finally, advancing our home region of Northwest Arkansas and the Arkansas-Mississippi Delta. And earlier this year, we partnered with both Edelman and Murmuration to do a deeper dive on Gen Z. We wanted to understand what they were experiencing in this moment, and what do they need more of, and how can we better understand? So what are their concerns and what drives their passions were some of the questions that we really dug into. And some of the themes that cropped up for us are similar to a lot of what you've heard tonight. Mental health concerns and struggles are persistent. More than 60% of Gen Z high schoolers are concerned about sexual assault, gun violence, or a friend attempting or completing suicide. Despite these challenges and others, Gen Z still sees a path forward for progress. 59% believe their generation will drive positive change. They are hopeful and deeply concerned about those who are more vulnerable than themselves. And many want to engage in work that benefits society. They want a better life for themselves, and many don't feel like their K-12 education is preparing them for the happy, fulfilling lives that they want to lead. And, I think we've heard as well in a couple of years, and we're seeing evidence now that they will be a significant portion of the electorate. They want to be politically engaged, but they don't feel seen or heard by those currently in office. And we also know that they want to collaborate, but they have not had exposure to what a functional version of that looks like. They don't feel like older generations are going to prioritize the needs of younger generations. There's a lack of trust. But these views are better explained with a member of Gen Z. So thank you, Lamar, for being here. I'd like you to introduce yourself, and as we think about how we can work together to arrive at common solutions, Lamar, the question I'd like to ask you is, what is most important to Gen Z regarding collaboration? How can we collaborate to help accelerate solutions for some of the biggest challenges society is facing?
All right.
Absolutely. So my name is Lamar Danley. I'm a senior political science major, African American Studies minor by way of Memphis, Tennessee. I just want to shout out Miss Winter, who came before me. It's good to always see Bison in the room, Bison representing Howard University, and also lifting voices. That's just amazing to see. For me, collaboration looks like really validating the younger generation's opinions and being more open-minded to non-traditional methods. I understand before I came up on this stage that it was talked about TikTok and like understanding how Generation Z really receives media and really receives communication. We receive a lot of things completely different. Even how you guys validate opinions as far as politics, just making sure that you're constantly validating and finding new non-traditional ways to reach us.
And with the skepticism that Gen Z is expressing about, the way today's leaders have future generations' best interest in mind, what are the implications of this, and what can we do to change them?
I think some of the implications simply are, could you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. So Gen Z is skeptical that today's leaders have your generation's best interest in mind. What are the implications of that, and how can we, change that?
Absolutely. So the skepticism obviously means we're not going to continue to vote. We're not going to continue to participate. We're not going to continue to want to collaborate if we're not being seen, heard. And so I think what we can change that is, again, being more, not only validating, but also creating a better pipeline to politics, not one that is so selective, and also just creating a system that understands Generation Z and the economic portion. Just being a member of Howard University and also working on the Hill, but then you also have to pay for school, you have to pay for your living situation, and then a lot of the political internships that is that pipeway to really being involved in civic engagement is not paying their interns or not creating that pathway. It really locks out and eliminates the opportunities for a lot of like younger Black individuals who cannot take on that internship and also not afford to pay their living expenses or pay their education. So it's just about creating a better pathway, but also being understanding about accessibility for younger people.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a good segue into the other question that I have, which is we obviously just held a significant election last week, and in many ways we're still in the election, waiting on important races to be decided. How has the last 2 weeks made you view getting involved in civic life, whether that's voting or volunteering or even running for office yourself?
Absolutely. So I'm from Arkansas, and so just seeing how southern states are starting to flip, to see how southern states are taking the different route that has been our environment, our reality for a very long time. It's very inspiring as a young person because it seems as though now our voices are starting to count, especially as my generation ends up to be more of the voters and more of the people taking political engagement. I think that even seeing how some of the races that we want to see come so close, even with the loss, just shows that sometimes we have to work a little bit harder, and as we get older, we'll have even more influence. So for me, it's just really inspiring. Really shows me that as we get older, we'll be a lot stronger.
So you're a college senior, and we've seen in our research that many Zoomers don't feel that their education provided them with what they need to be successful. Does that resonate with you and your peers? What do you think people in this room should be thinking about or focusing on in K-12 education right now to ensure that future generations will be set up for success?
Absolutely. So as I end my college career and I come to the end of the closing and kind of enter adulthood and enter life, I realized that we have lost the substance of education. Education is becoming a lot easier. Education is more about finding the answer in the passage and being less innovative, less creative, less critical in our thinking, and more so just finding the easy way out. So for me, I'm looking for a lot of longevity and a lot of substance in education, and taking the educational skills that we have lost, such as critical thinking, and really diving in with collaboration to come back into our school systems and kind of moving past these performative educational platforms that we use in schools today, and really think about how we want our kids to be educated.
And what should collaboration look between you, your peers, and older generations look like? I mean, what do you think institutional leaders need to know about you and what you expect when working with them to drive big changes on important issues?
Absolutely. So we're just looking for mentorship. We're looking for an opportunity to actually collaborate on a lower level, an opportunity for you guys to provide feedback to us, but also to kind of help us work through our situations and actually have tangible solutions, even as a young person. It's very important to see that a lot of our dreams and a lot of our aspirations for political atmospheres as well as educational institutions be at the forefront of your conversations and not an aftermath or an afterthought as a young person. I think a lot of people have the young people's best interests at heart, but when young people express that their solutions may not be the best, although it may seem the best in their eyes, I think a lot of people put us aside. So just making sure that with mentorship comes correct feedback, a lot of positivity, and continuation of opportunities, and the continuation of paying attention to us and walking us through and walking us towards more political engagement.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. So thank you so much, Lamar. Thank you all, and we appreciate it.
Our next guest is a recent Kennedy Center Next 50 honoree. She's an MC, actress, and producer. And at just 11 years old, she's sharing a message of change and collaboration. Performing her song, Dear DC, please welcome Fly Zaya.
Hi, everybody. My name is Fly Zaya. I'm an 11-year-old MC from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for the Hill for inviting me. And I just want to let all the youth know that to always keep your head to the sky no matter what, and don't listen to the haters, and just keep on pushing. I'm a witness. I can see what's going on. I hope you listen. Cause I'ma put it in my songs. I know the difference between what's right and what's wrong. This is business. We've been fighting for too long, man. Where is this? I used to consider it my home. You left me stranded. Now I'm feeling all alone and abandoned from all the hate that you shown single-handed. Now you got me in a zone and it's candid. You can hear it in my tone. I'm demanding that you turn every stone misunderstanding, causing hate to be thrown up for my branding, and it hurts to the bone. Dear DC, clap your hands, everybody. This is a letter from Z. Yeah, dear DC, I hope you listen to me. I'm disappointed in the way that you train the human being. We're supposed to be the leaders. What does that really mean? Supposed to be the freest of the free speech. What happened to the times when teachers would really teach? What happened to the times when you handled what's in my reach? What happened to the times there was go-go lie in the streets? What happened to the love that you promised to give each? Every one of us, but the contract feels breached. Dear DC, dear DC, this is a letter from Z. Yeah, dear DC. I always try to represent, but the C don't represent me. I try to be the best, but you fail to see what's in me. I try to feel blessed, but the stress is kind of heavy. But through it all, I gotta stay humble and be ready. But my will is strong, I'm soon to be revolutionary. Never will I fall, fighting for all, I'm legendary. I really thought the people came first, not secondary. All the animosity in the streets unnecessary. All for nothing, cause police was pushing and shoving. Lost my family in the mix, we started running. Pulled my little sis to the side, they kept coming. Now it's time I had to decide to do something. I just screamed, seeing daddy down on his knees. Mommy running in a circle, she crying. I'm yelling, please, this is not rehearsal. Just a moment I had to see. My feelings are controversial, just a letter from Z. Dear DC, dear DC, this is a letter from Z. Yeah, dear DC, I hope you listen to me. Thank you so much for the Hill for having me. Thank you so much for the Hill for having me. I had a great time. I hope you guys had a good time too. Bye.
Can we do one more round of applause for Fly Zaya? Y'all, she's only 11 years old and already she's got the voice of a powerful young woman. We love it. What an amazing performance. Joining us now remotely is Khalil Green, otherwise known as the Gen Z historian. With over 8 million likes on TikTok, Khalil hosts a hidden history series with the mission to share knowledge about history, injustice, politics, and culture from a new perspective.
Hello, what's up?
Hi, Khalil. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So I want to start off by asking you to talk a little bit more about your Hidden History series. How did you get it started?
Yeah, so I got started back in January of 2021 on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I made my first video ever about the whitewashing of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and how he, in the eyes of the American public, was de-radicalized over time. Specifically, I talked about a time where the FBI actually had been found out to sabotage his work and, of course, try to sabotage the work of many civil rights activists. From there, I just started recounting more hidden history series and stories under the tagline, What America kind of covered up as the creepy, crazy, and once again, covered up parts of American history.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think, especially about your Hidden History series, is that your videos are coming out at a time when we're seeing some work to keep those histories hidden, particularly history that does center Black and brown voices. How has that affected your approach to choosing which stories to highlight, and what has the response been from other Gen Zers?
The great thing about the work that I do and the use of social media is that, unlike as we see unfortunately with many school systems around the nation, I'm not at the mercy of a school board voting to strike down a part of my educational curriculum that I share on my platform. So I love sharing stories that I might imagine would be left out or struck down in school curriculums, especially K through 12 curriculums in these states where people are trying to cover up things about American history and trying to really change the narrative from one that's critical and realistic to one that upholds an American mythology that is at odds with the realities of so many marginalized communities throughout the US. So the way that I like to choose my stories is by focusing on something that's happening in the world right now. For example, we can talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act, and something that I might create a video about, which I will be doing soon, is the history of the act and the history of the realities of how Native American children were treated throughout American history in just the past century. So I like to expand on what's happening in the real world through storytelling and through the stories that I share on my platform.
And these are powerful stories. They're very moving. What has been the response from, whether that's people your own age, other TikTok users, your family? What is the response that you get?
The response is overwhelmingly positive. I mean, I had a huge boost last year when the New York Times featured me in their Up Next series. And from there, I started getting all sorts of inquiries and invites for collaboration and partnership from all over the nation, all over the world, really. I've even done international interviews through Zoom. And it's been really fulfilling to see people like teachers and young people say on my videos, hey, I didn't know that before I watched this video. I know that now. I'm gonna share that with someone, whether it be a family member, a friend, a student, or just someone that I disagree with, so that they can see your perspective, and they can learn more about history in the way that the viewer did. So just seeing the response, which has overwhelmingly been super positive and super responsive to the stories that I'm sharing, has been one of the most fulfilling parts of the work that I do.
With the stories that you're sharing, they are innately political, unfortunately, even though they shouldn't maybe be. How do you see the way that our government and perhaps other institutions can better harness the power of content creators like yourself to enhance social good?
I was actually one of 30 TikTokers invited to a briefing that the White House held shortly after the war in Ukraine broke out, with the head of national security, as well as the communications director of the White House. And I thought that was just one great example of the transparency that the White House and other government institutions can have with the American public by way of communicating with content creators. We were not paid to be there. We were not given any talking points to come out with, but we were shared information in the way that you would with traditional reporters. And I think that there was a lot of overwhelming support for this initiative, at least when people started to understand what was going on, understand that we were authentic, that we were able to share our own perspectives and be critical of the information that we receive. So in as much as governmental organizations and entities can partner with creators and share them information so that they can be transparent with their own audiences, I think that's the best way to collaborate and partner with us.
What I find really fascinating is that you are an activist, and your activism is coming through the internet, which sounds absolutely insane. And probably, I think back to Martin Luther King Jr., 1960, would probably not imagine that somebody like you, somebody like Winter, could be using social media or the internet in this way. What do you think has really encouraged your generation to take this social justice fight across the globe, really, through the use of the internet?
It's the power of the internet. Back in the 1960s, grassroots organizing was hugely laborious, and you had to knock on doors and spend months and months just even creating awareness around a protest. Whereas nowadays, someone can make an Instagram flyer using like Canva, post it on their story, and then have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people then go and reshare it. And that's what we saw drive a lot of the organizing that happened back in 2020 to create some of the largest protests ever in American history, and a movement that had participation in all 50 states and around the world. And that's something that you couldn't necessarily do with the technology of the past, but you can do today. And I think young people are starting to be aware that social media and the internet gives us power that we wouldn't have otherwise, that these larger, older institutions are not granting young people. So we go out and seize it for ourselves by utilizing the things that we know best, which is digital media and virality and communication, to then enact change in the way that we see fit.
I know we've been focused really on the positives that can be harnessed through social media. What are some of the cons that we need to be aware of, whether we're activists like yourself or that you want to make sure that our institutions know as they're trying to, again, harness this power of content creators like yourself?
If I had to choose one main one that I really want to push,
just one.
Yeah, I'll start with one and maybe go into a few others, but I really want to hone in on the idea of combating disinformation. I think that's a primary goal that everyone should have. Something that I always champion is including sources and including your logic behind what you're saying and how you're using evidence and primary resources and other verifiable sources to then share information online. We're even seeing it right now with a lot of what's happening in Iran and the protests. There was a huge sort of headline around like the protesters and how many were going to be executed, and now there's a bunch of confusion on whether or not that statistic is true or not true, and it's all because there's not a good culture on social media or a good just standard of ethics when it comes to sharing information and sharing people's perspectives with facts. So the first thing that I would say is like everyone just needs to be aware of disinformation, educate and equip yourself to determine whether or not something is valid, and always cross-reference and check multiple sources before you determine a fact as actually valid that you find on the internet. After that, I think the second one is definitely going to be the hate and just like the general culture of when people are faceless and they don't have any form of accountability behind what they say, that they can say some of the meanest things. I've dealt with it on a few of my videos. Actually, I had one video about Elvis Presley and his role in appropriating Black culture, and I actually got like a 2,000-word email from a random account just like calling me all sorts of names and just super hateful things, right? So it's a very weird place to be on the internet and have so many people dislike you who you have no idea who they are. But I think if we can create more of a culture, however that might happen, of just like civility, that would be a primary goal for me and something that everyone should be aware of exists right now as an issue online.
As you continue your journey as our TikTok Gen Z historian, what do you want government to take away from the lessons that you're teaching? What types of values that do you want to portray for our government to say, this is what we need to be doing for our young people?
The first thing I would say is to be transparent. so many of the stories that I cover on my account are stories of the government committing injustices towards the American people, but at the same time, things that people are not necessarily aware of. And I think the issue is that whether it be school curriculums or just generally when it comes to atonement and reparation, the U.S. government doesn't do a great job of acknowledging the harm that it's done in marginalized communities in the past. So just being transparent, promoting education, and being upfront with shortcomings and mistakes is something that's hugely important. One great example is if you go on the CDC website right now, they have a whole webpage dedicated to the Tuskegee experiments and what went wrong there and how it was a governmental agency that affected all of this harm against Black men, medical experimentation and medical harm. So just being transparent is number one. I'd say after being transparent, the most important thing that government can do is actually work with young people and be collaborative and bring us to these decision-making rooms, decision-making tables for us to share our perspective. Once again, the White House has been doing a great job of that with content creators this year especially, but I want to see other government organizations, whether it be the State Department and International Affairs or whatever multitude of government agencies exist out there, bringing on young people to have our voices heard in terms of constant and current day events.
Absolutely. Khalil, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much.
Please welcome House reporter for The Hill, Michael Schnell.
Thank you, Cheyenne. For change to happen, solutions need to be influenced and informed by those who understand it best. Up next is our panel of Gen Z changemakers here to discuss the issues that matter most to them and what it will take to work together to shape a better future overall. So first up, please help me welcome Lauren Manas. She's the Advocacy Director for the Sunrise Movement. Ananda Bhatia, the founder and president of the Modernization Staff Association. Carly Matthews, Communications Director at the American Conservation Coalition, and Tegan Lechler, Director of Finance and Operations at Social Equity in Education. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation. So I want to start off by talking about and mentioning another Gen Z member that we've mentioned a couple times tonight, Congressman-elect Maxwell Alejandro Frost, who was just elected last week to be the first Gen Z member of Congress. He'll be representing Florida's 10th Congressional District. At a press conference this weekend, he said something really interesting. He said, "I've been asked a lot about what young voters care about. I don't think they care about anything different than anyone else." And he later added, "The difference is the lens in which they see those same issues." And I think that really gets to the crux of Gen Z. We care about the same issues, but we see it through a different perspective. So starting our conversation off there, I want to ask all four of you, what do you think is the most important issue to Gen Z, and how do you see that different perspective playing out? Lauren, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. And I'm glad you brought Maxwell Frost into this conversation. I'm also from Florida and had the honor to work with Maxwell kind of organizing in the past few years and then really encouraging this leap into actually being part of governing and co-governing with our generation. So yeah, I think growing up in Florida as a young person, I saw the realities of the climate crisis firsthand and the realities of the climate crisis specifically intersecting with racial and economic justice. And yeah, I knew from a very, very young age that this was just foundational to my entire future moving forward, that every single other issue that I would ever experience, just living with every year getting warmer and every year getting more unstable and having disasters all around us was just going to be the reality that I faced, and that I was not going to let people in power continue to harm our communities by giving more and more power to the fossil fuel industry. And yeah, as soon as I kind of understood the connections between people who were supposed to be representing me, but actually were representing people like fossil fuel executives who were just destroying our communities and our futures. I could not accept that. And so that is the issue that I work on because it touches every single other issue we could ever imagine.
Yeah, I definitely think climate change is one of the first things that comes to mind. Gun violence being another one. I mean, I think a lot of us grew up doing active shooter drills in school, and I think to that question, how is the lens that we view issues different? I just think that young people really think about the issues that are talked about all the time at national debates, on the House floor, as impacting them, not just more immediately, but for the rest of their lives. There really are, I polled some of my friends, some of my sister and some of her friends about what are the issues that matter to them the most, and they're saying the same thing that a lot of, I think people were talking about this last election cycle, like abortion, for example, are at the top of their mind. But, the decisions that are made now are going to impact decisions that will continue to be made for the next 20, 40, 60 years. So it's going to have a really lasting impact, and that's what we're thinking about.
Yeah, I would echo, definitely climate change is top of mind for our generation. And as kind of the resident right of center person on this panel, I have to say, that concern crosses ideological differences, and young conservatives are really concerned about this issue too. But I'll add on, and it's not an issue itself, but I think that young people are really tired of nothing getting done, and our elected leaders, kind of leaning on rhetoric and what sounds good, and not actually, kind of reaching the hand across the aisle, or, making that unlikely alliance and actually getting something across the finish line. So that's what my work focuses on a lot, is kind of building that bridge between conservatives, progressives, everyone in between, and ensuring that we can actually get a result out of this work.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot to add in terms of the issues we care about, just because everyone's kind of said the things already, like gun violence and abortion, mental health, of course, climate change. I think, though, how we differ in terms of our lens is that our generation seems to have a much more of a critical systems level lens. So we are, I guess, brought up having conversations about systems of oppression and about systemic level violence, and talking about intersectionality and the way that we experience different oppressions based on our identities and the intersections of those identities. So I think that kind of ability to engage in critical conversations around system impacts, that is how our generation views things differently than maybe generations before us.
I want to dive into something. All four of you mentioned climate change, the environment, of course, a very pressing issue to young voters particularly. And Carly, I want to specifically zero in on something you said. Young voters, Gen Z, they're just tired of things not getting done. So something that's unique about Gen Z voters is they believe they're a force for change. They see labels less. They're more open to people. Do you think that fostering that open environment could help break through the partisanship that we, quite frankly, all the time see in Washington? Do you think that Gen Z can be the ones to sort of force that through and get something done? Carly, we'll go to you first.
Well, I certainly hope so, and that's what a lot of my work focuses on. In fact, some of my coworkers were actually in Egypt at COP27 last week, and they did an event with Dream.org, which is Van Jones's very progressive organization, and they had really honest conversations about where there's overlap in our priorities, and where we have disagreement, what won't work for our collaboration. But I think that having more conversations like that is really important. Growing up, I hated conflict. It made me very uncomfortable. But as I grew into an adult, I realized I still don't like conflict, but I love conversations. And as long as someone's willing to come to the table and talk with me in an honest way about where they're coming from on an issue, I think that really makes a lot of change. And obviously it has to go beyond just that initial conversation, but that's how things get started. And I think that Gen Z is more willing to have those conversations. I remember being in college and having really, kind of hard political discussions, on my bed in my dorm with a friend who disagreed with me. So I think that, we can kind of break through that political noise and actually, find the common ground.
Lauren, I want to get you in on this because you're with Sunrise, obviously focuses on climate change and the environment significantly.
Yeah, definitely. I think building off what Tegan said, I think that we at Sunrise, and I think as a generation, understand that climate change was not inevitable. It was created by racialized capitalism, extracting our resources from Black and brown people's bodies and extracting resources from the land and seeing those things as inextricable. And then having people in power and systems that maintained these people in power, elite, white, descending from Europe men, and that's the way this country was designed. That's, the literal rules that determine this country and who has power. And yeah, so right now, I think we understand as a generation that we're facing the consequences of decades of an economic system that has given privilege and safety to a small number of people at the expense of a lot of other people, the majority of the world, and our generation is bearing those consequences. And so instead of seeing it as Democrat versus Republican, we really see it as we need to change this economic system. It is not working for so many people. It is really working for, 0.5, 1%, 5% of people. But I would say that is not working if we want a democracy. And so, yeah, and it is not working in terms of having a stable climate that we can live for multiple more generations to come. And so we need all of us that are experiencing the crises at our hands to join together and say, this is not working, and therefore what movements have always done is force the change we need. It's not which party is in power. Different parties have been in power while change has happened. It's social movements from the outside making it inevitable that transformation will happen through governance and other means.
All that said, I want to move into sort of the second phase of the conversation that I was hoping to get to. We established what issues are most important to Gen Z. Now let's talk about that advocacy. And I specifically, Tegan, I want to go to you first. A defining characteristic of Gen Z is that we're digital natives. We don't remember the time when there were no smartphones. Oftentimes, the digital sphere, the internet, is sort of thought of to have negative influences. But as we know as Gen Z, it can be used as a force for good. So Tegan, you previously organized with Gen Z for Change, an organization that is now a coalition of 500 progressive social media influencers. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think social media is an optimal way to reach Gen Z voters? And how do you think social media can be used to speak to non-Gen Z voters? How do you get mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa to understand that social media can be used as a force for good?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that social media is so, loved amongst Gen Z is that there's no qualification in order to talk about politics or issues, right? Like, you don't have to have gone to Harvard to have a TikTok account. You can be in the streets filming what you're seeing, filming the march you're at, the rally you're at, or the violence that you're seeing, and sharing that with the world. And there's no requirement of, kind of these, institutions that maybe are not accessible to all people. You don't have to have wealth, you don't have to have privilege, you don't have to have these big names and institutions behind you in order to share information, to share your analysis, to share your perspective on social media. Of course, there's good and bad to just anyone being able to share their perspective, but I think that social media gets a bad rap from older generations, particularly because, like you said, we are native to it, but older generations maybe don't understand it. And I think that's kind of a human instinct to dislike or have negative feelings towards things you don't understand, right? I think, though, that one way that we can kind of bridge that gap and bring older folks into social media is simply by humbling ourselves, I want to say. Like, when you're showing your mom, oh, this is how TikTok works, and you say things like, well, duh, or like, I can't believe you don't understand this, or like, no, like, this is a For You page.
We never do that. Why would you say we do that?
I do that. And I'm like, Mom, this is a For You page. Like, what is not making sense? But that obviously puts her walls up. She doesn't want to feel stupid. She doesn't want to feel dumb. She's my mom, right? And so I think just like coming and being willing to have conversations and not make people feel less than, make people feel uncomfortable, and just really, kind of level the playing field and seek to genuinely meet people where they're at and show them how something can be a tool for them and what they're interested in as well, is a way that we can bring other generations onto social media.
That's a really good point. I want to get to we're running out of time, but I want to get to the third prong of this idea that I wanted to get to was we've spoken about what issues Gen Z cares about. We've spoken about how they advocate for those. What about now how they become a force for change? And one way to do that through civic participation is actually getting involved in politics, running for office as we saw this cycle, but even just working in the Capitol, let's say. So Ananda, I want to go to you with this. Gen Z is more pro-government, and that can be a real opportunity. People seeing Washington as a force for change and not just a place where there's partisan gridlock. So you work at the Modernization Staff Association, so tell us a little bit about what the group is working on, and where do you see reforms headed? And I specifically want to zero in on coming out of the pandemic, which had an outsized role on young voters, on Gen Z. How is your organization working to foster that face-to-face communication, especially after we had 2+ years of this virtual lifestyle? Because at the end of the day, politics is about people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Staff Association, I founded it a few years ago. It's bipartisan, bicameral, and it's really about empowering junior staffers and making their lives easier on Capitol Hill. So we focus on a lot of issues that matter to junior staff. It's everything from the simple day-to-day tasks that they're working on, like tours or flags, constituent requests, that sort of thing, making those processes easier and more streamlined. A lot of things on Capitol Hill are still pretty old systems. A lot of things are done on paper, so just bringing that a little more into the 21st century. And then issues that just impact junior staff, their mental health, making it easier to create a pipeline to getting onto Capitol Hill. So we've got a staffer who's working on going out into communities, college campuses, and educating young people about how to get into government if that's something that they want to do. So to bring down some of those barriers. So some of the things we're really working on, like you pointed out, the pandemic was really difficult for Hill staffers, definitely for the younger ones who are often the people who are on the phones talking to constituents. So during the pandemic, you were taking all of these phone calls that were often really difficult conversations from your house without any support system or anyone else to talk to. So now that we're back in person, the number one thing that junior staffers are asking us to do is to just form connections with other staff, to get to know other people, to have a network so that they can bounce ideas off of them, have a support system. So we're working on, making it easier to do that.
The last question I want to get to before we go to the audience is, let's bring the conversation back to where we started, Maxwell Alejandro Frost, because he's just such an important figure for Gen Z. How important is Gen Z representation in government? And as more people who are part of Gen Z become of age to vote, they're going to become more of a formidable voting bloc in politics. So what role will Gen Z play in future elections? And are we at a change in paradigm right now with Gen Z becoming more involved in politics? I would love to get everyone's take on this, but if we can just keep the answers short. We can start over here, Lauren.
Yeah, so we just saw last week. Keeping track of, wow.
It's been a busy month.
Yeah, this was the highest turnout for a midterm election in the past 30 years because of the participation of Gen Z. So I think it's undeniable that we are a serious majority voting bloc in the electorate. And with that comes tremendous power and leverage that we will use as a generation to make sure that our issues are at the forefront. And yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that we actually put ourselves in power and co-govern and build voting blocks and majorities and people that feel accountable to our movements and our generation, and not just at the federal level, but in state houses, in courts, in school boards, and city councils. So we at Sunrise are working to do just that and make sure we get people from our movements and our generation into all levels of government.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. I mean, you need representation to get things done. One thing that I'm a little worried about is that I think, Gen Z, we have very high standards, we're very passionate, but sometimes we look a little bit for that ideological purity that makes it more difficult to get things done. So I do worry that, I started off in college campus organizing. That was my first career, and I think a lot of Young people, you know, if they don't see a candidate that perfectly aligns with their values, they sit it out, they don't vote. So making sure that people know that, you know, if you give up your voice, then you're giving up your power, and that it's just really important to stay involved no matter what, and that's the only way we're actually going to continue to see this kind of change.
Yeah, and I would just say, as a conservative environmentalist, young conservatives are so much more likely to want environmental solutions than their older counterparts. So it's really important that we have young conservatives, kind of the next generation of our movement, running for office and proposing solutions.
Yeah, I would just say the disability rights movement has this really awesome saying that says, nothing about us without us. And I hope that the election of Maxwell Frost is kind of our first step in that direction of embodying that line as Gen Z politicians.
I think we'll try to sneak in one audience question if anyone has anything for our fabulous panelists.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. I have a question. As you uplift the positives of the use of social media, what do you do in your own work to combat, you know, the pandemic of mis and disinformation and how that's been harmful, as well as the mental health effects on young folks? And then secondly, I haven't yet heard anybody talk about the influence of money in our political system versus the power of Gen Z. Love your thoughts on that.
Anyone in particular want to take that?
I can talk about money. I don't use.
We could talk
social
about
media.
that for a whole other event.
I don't really use social media that much, so everyone else here can talk about that. But yeah, I mean, I started with you know, my own politicization and how I got into this work through understanding the corrupting power and just the scale of money, especially in our work on climate from the fossil fuel industry, and how much control they have over our politicians. And really, I think a main goal of Sunrise was really understanding the tremendous power and stranglehold that they have had over our politicians, and the lies that created and misinformation that we were told about the role of fossil fuels and denying the climate change and everything. And so, yeah, we have to build a movement loud enough and louder than all the money of the fossil fuel industry. And that's basically like the way that we will force the transformative change that we need.
Does someone want to take the social media part of it?
I can start and just say that, yeah, I had a great college professor who would start every class, he would go through students' social media accounts, and he would pull up something that they posted that was absolutely not true at all from both sides of the aisle and share it with the class and make them defend why they decided to reshare that post. So I think, yeah, it's pretty intense. I know. But it just really opens your eyes, because it's really easy to just assume that not just the things that you're reading in general. I mean, I think that we as Gen Zers sometimes feel like we're immune to some of the disinformation. We're like, oh, well, I grew up with the internet. I understand, you know, what is a good source of information, what isn't. But to see your peers sharing the same kinds of things and not realizing, it was really eye-opening. So I will say one of the benefits of social media that I've definitely seen is, you know, it really has gotten younger people so much more involved in politics at an early age. I mean, I don't think I was very politically involved until at least high school, certainly college. I mean, my younger sister was really invested in what was going on in the world back in middle school, and I think social media is the big reason for that. So I think, you know, we've got to stay vigilant, but it's definitely got its pros and cons.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for being here.
Fabulous guests this evening. It's been amazing to hear everyone's thoughts and perspectives on Gen Z and their impact on politics here in the United States. That brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of The Hill and the Walton Family Foundation, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us here in person and to those who are watching online. If you missed any portion of tonight's program and discussion, the full event will be online in a few minutes or an hour or so. It'll be available on thehill.com shortly. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your night. For those who are staying here at Longview, we hope you'll stick around for the party. We have a bar in the back with drinks on the house, and our DJ, Miss Her, will be spinning the rest of the night. Come on back. Woo!